Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special edition of the West Shore Photography Club. It is Wednesday, August the 11th, and we're very pleased to have continued our discussion about flower photography. Guys, I'm going to mute everybody. Getting some nasty noise here. Okay, and the co-hosts, please unmute yourself there. All right, so we're ready to get started with this meeting. It should be an exciting and informative session. And I'm going to turn it over to Joe to talk about what we're going to do tonight and to introduce our presenters. Okay, Joe.
This evening, this is a follow-on to Elaine Schuch's class last week, where she reviewed her tools and techniques and her vision for flower photography. And then she took us all to Hershey Gardens last Saturday with absolutely spectacular light in the morning. It was just, as Norbert Fry said, it was just like a huge softbox over us. And it wasn't too hot in the morning, and we didn't have any kids in the morning either.
Yeah, but Joe, it was cloudy.
I know. And that's what some lady said. She said, I bet you guys really wish we get some sun, get a nice lot of bright clouds, sunshine in here. Well, whatever. So Elaine did not get finished with her presentation. So we're going to tonight have the second half of her presentation, which means she's going to be taking some images and then she's going to be processing some of them for us, as well as talking about her vision and how she approached some of the images. And then we have Patti Volpe. And we'll have Patti introduce herself when her portion of the session comes up. It'll be around 7:30 or so, give or take. And she'll talk about her vision and using filters to be able to add some painterly effects and special effects to her images. So that's what we're going to be doing. And then just for informational purposes, next Monday night, we're going to have a session on high ISO and how you can use it to your advantage, how you can shoot to be able to minimize the possibility of a noise component when you do high ISO. And also we're going to be demonstrating the Topaz denoise software to mitigate any noise that may happen. That's going to be one for both beginners as well as some advanced folks, because there's some tips and tricks in there that you may not be aware of. And then after that, not next Saturday or the following, but on the 28th, Mary Fox is going to be leading us on a photo shoot down at Italian Lake in Harrisburg, which is absolutely phenomenal. But that's as far as I'm going to go. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Elaine. Elaine, you're on.
Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see my Lightroom library?
We sure can.
Okay. This may last a long time. It may go until 9. I don't know.
Okay, I'll take care of that.
Okay.
Okay, for those of you who were on my call last week, during the last half, I went through a number of these images and just talked about a little bit about my vision, what caught my attention about the flower, and what I really wanted to emphasize or bring front and center in the final image. I also talked about how and why I exposed them, and even a little bit about how I processed them, as well as some of the challenges that I encountered as I was photographing them. I'm going to continue to do that with a few more images, depending upon how much time we have. But I've also been asked to talk about how I create my black backgrounds. I do that a lot when I want to isolate a flower, such as in this first one here, just to really bring out the details of that flower and eliminate all distractions. I don't do it on all of them, but I have a whole collection of a series called Singular Sensation that all have black backgrounds like that. So I'm going to jump ahead and talk specifically about those that do have backgrounds to begin with, because I'm going to take you through some of my programs to show you how I actually did it, including Lightroom and Photoshop. Now, the first two I want to show you. This one, I actually used a physical background, and that's probably the easiest method. There are many methods to apply black backgrounds, but this one I actually photographed inside and placed it on just a black foam core board. A lot of people like to use just a black fabric. Any flat, matte black surface or even white surface or any color of your choice will work, as long as it does not have any kind of a sheen on it or a texture that will pick up sheen when you photograph it. That can be resolved in post, but it's best just not to have to deal with that problem in the first place. So I always use a very matte flat finish. And this was the foam core board. This particular flower, I would normally have photographed outside. I was really drawn to this little cluster, but it's a very tiny flower, and it was kind of buried amongst a lot of giants around it, and there was no way to really separate it out so I could get a good clear shot of it. So I snipped off the cluster and I brought it in and put it on my table on top of this board. And because it is such a tiny flower, I used a macro lens because I wanted to hone in on all of that detail, particularly the blue pollen, which is really unusual for a flower. It just matched the color of the flowers itself. I did, because I wanted to capture the whole thing sharply. I wanted everything from one side to the other to be in complete sharp focus. I had to up my aperture setting to 14, which of course mitigated the light that I had. And so I had to use a little bit of flash. I used a very low power diffused flash to supplement the light that I was getting from my kitchen window on this one. The next one, I used the identical process. This flower I actually spotted lying in the mud after rain on the side of the road, and it was completely saturated with water. And I just, I noticed that transparency about it and wanted to capture that. And I knew that the black background would probably be the best way to do that. And again, with the flash, it really picked that up, as well as the water drops on it. Of course, I had to wash the mud off of it before, before I could get it. But it was an interesting flower. It's actually kind of creepy looking in many ways, but I thought it was very interesting. This one, I didn't have to use a prop at all. This happened to be in front of a black wall at Ashcombe's nursery. And just like that, there were no other distractions, no obstructions. It looked exactly like that. Very little was required in post-process except increasing the blacks a little bit to darken the background. There were a few glare spots on it, but it also made the yellow color of the flower a little bit richer. And then I applied a soft vignette, black vignette around the corners to make the stem fade out before it got to the bottom, rather than looking like it's amputated when it's cut off. Now this one is one that I applied in Lightroom, and I'm going to walk you through Lightroom to show you how I did that. It was actually a kind of a last minute shot. I did have a really quick vision as I was walking out the door. I loved the way that the flowers were kind of bonding with each other and forming that little trio, but I didn't put a whole lot of thought into how I was going to expose it. I knew right away that I wanted a black background for the contrast and just to really show off the flowers themselves. There wasn't a good background to begin with because it was kind of crowded in the middle of a bunch of pots of flowers that were very similar, and it was messy looking. So I wasn't too concerned about how I exposed it, other than I knew that I had to somewhat underexpose to avoid blowing out the highlights in the white petals and avoid the brightness of the messy background. One of the important things, if you intend to apply a background in Lightroom, a black background, is to make sure that that background is a little bit darker, because if it's too bright and there's too much detail in it, it's very difficult to apply the black background in Lightroom, and that's when I would end up going into Photoshop to do it. I'm going to take you now to the raw file and take you through the process of how I actually edited that. Oops. We're a little slow.
Well, that's coming up. Elaine, there's a question. Do you use a ring flash?
I have a ring flash. I have not found it to be particularly useful when I'm doing macros. It's not the best ring flash in the world, and it's probably not bright enough for my purposes, but it tends to shine the light more on the background than it does on the flower.
Okay.
So I prefer to use a flash with a globe diffuser, and I put it on TTL and I set it at a very low power so it doesn't overpower the flower.
Thank you.
I think I have to share my screen again to bring up. Nope, not yet. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, this is the raw image, and I just cropped it preliminarily. But other than that, this is it. Not a stunning photo, obviously. It needs a lot of work, but I knew I was going to bleep out that background anyway. The first thing I noticed about this photo was that the white balance was off a bit, which doesn't usually happen with me. The flower really did have kind of a creamy tint to it, but it wasn't quite that yellow. So the first thing that I'm going to do, Joe, I have to move you out of the way here, is adjust that temperature just slightly. Oops, to brighten up the white petals and take some of that yellow out. Oh, you keep getting in my way. All right. Another thing I like to do as a matter of routine in Lightroom is increase the clarity a bit. That for me is one of the best ways to bring more clarity to detail before I sharpen it. It just really brings out the contrast in the shadows and the highlights and the petals without making it look grainy. And I'm going to actually increase the blacks a little bit as well. Okay. Then I will move down because I know I'm going to blacken this out. I'm going to take the highlight priority in post-crop vignetting and move that down. See, most of this is already black. What I sometimes have to do is move the midpoint in so it draws that circle in a little bit. And if you move your feather slider temporarily all the way over to the left, you can see where that ring lies. So you can bring it in as close as you want. You can adjust the roundness so that it's more round or less round. Can't bring it in too much because I don't want to cover the tips of this quite yet. And feathering back out. Now, what this does is the way I have set this, it leaves a little bit of a shadow in the tips, which for me is okay. I kind of like that. Some people may not. If you don't, then you can bring that midpoint back a little bit. Now there is still some green background visible in here. So then what I would do is use my brush. Good to go. Oh. This is not what I'm doing, what I'm wanting it to do. Bear with me a minute. Okay, for some reason, this is not doing what I'm wanting it to do. But essentially what I do is take the brush and then move my exposure down a little bit and just brush in those areas where you can still see the green. And then you end up with the black background that you want. Now, I've also been asked to demonstrate while I'm in Lightroom how I apply a frame or a border, which I often do in Facebook because Facebook tends to arbitrarily apply some strange color based on what it deems as color matching when the aspect ratio of your image does not match its specifications exactly. So in some cases, if you've got a beautiful green foliage in the middle of an image, for example, with a little bit of a yellowish green somewhere near the outside, it will apply a rather ugly kind of an olive green border to it, which is really distracting. So when I apply a border, it seems to eliminate that in most cases, except sometimes in portrait mode, it does not. So when I apply my border, I like to use the print module. It can be done a couple of other ways. Some people use the transform module in Develop to do that. I like a rather simple frame, so I will generally just pick something that is has a stroke border, a very thin stroke border, which is the inside edge here. That white line is your stroke border. If you take it off, all you have is a black. You still see the white there, but that's not really visible when you generate the photo. That's just part of your grid when you're working in the print module. I kind of like that stroke border, and you can adjust that to any width that you want. So you can make that a little wider, you can make it narrow. You can adjust the color to black or gray or even any color that you want. I usually leave that white. You can also adjust your background color, which would be this would be your background color right here. And I usually leave that at black. Now, right now I have this set already to a square paper size, if you will. It's not really paper, but in the page setup, it wants to know what size you are going to print, so to speak, on. And I've already set that up to 12 by 12 for square, because this is a square image. But you can print to any size that you think you want to make your aspect ratio. So if you're, for example, if you've cropped it to 11 by 14, you would pick paper size of 1114, and then make sure that your cell size, which is the size of the image itself without the frame, will fit within that. So I usually pick something that's like a ½ inch smaller than the actual paper size that I'm going to print to. It just leaves a very narrow border as opposed to something wide that may look a little bit distracting. The most important thing when when doing this is that your print job has to be set to JPEG file, because this is a print module. It's primarily used for printing to a printer, and that's what the default is. So you want to make sure you go on and you change that to a JPEG file, because when you are done with this, if you're going to use a frame like this, you're not going to go through the export process. You're actually going to print to file. And it will then take you, I don't know if you can see this or not. Can you see my pop-up save file box?
Yeah, we
Yes.
can see that.
You can see that? Okay. So that's where it asks you to enter your file name and the type of file that you want. It's already set to JPEG because that's the way you set it in here. And I'm not going to save it. But that's as easy as it is for print purpose, for frame purposes. Now, I will tell you that it generates a much larger file than it does if you're just saving it through the export process. That's the only real disadvantage to me.
Could I ask a question about that?
Yes.
When you set the paper size to 12 inches by 12 inches, you did that because you wanted a square aspect ratio?
Yes.
And
I had already cropped the raw image to square. And it just happens that in the drop-down list of available paper sizes, the only square one was 12 by 12.
oh, if you created a custom size and made it smaller, like 4 by 4 inch,
That
Yeah.
would make a much smaller file.
yeah, then your file, yeah, right.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Good.
Any other questions about this one? Oh, I did want to go back. I'm sorry. And just talk a little bit about enhancing the center of this flower a little bit. It looks a little bit drab and flat. So often what I will do just to bring out the colors in the center is just use the luminance and the saturation sliders. So in this one, I would just want to increase the saturation a little bit. And then the luminance slider, really lighten that up. Just makes it a little bit more vibrant. I do know that I ultimately took this one back into Photoshop as well to do some refining on the shadows and the whites, as well as some sharpening, because I wasn't really happy with the final product in Lightroom. Okay, going to take you then back to my library.
Oh, you okay if I make a comment here about that?
Sure.
You mentioned in your first session about those little pieces of pollen or stuff that's on the white petals. Would you address that again? You didn't
Yeah.
remove that.
Yes, I didn't. I'm glad you brought that up because I had intended to talk about that a little bit. This one is particularly dusty. And if this hadn't been a last minute shot, and if I had had my little paintbrush with me, I would have dusted these off. That is just dirt. And to me, it's not particularly natural to see that. If that were just a little bit of pollen that had settled around here, I would not really object to that at all because it's perfectly natural. And even some little flaws in the petals, maybe a tiny little bug hole, I wouldn't necessarily object to, and I wouldn't try to remove them. Anything that is particularly distracting, especially something like this, I would definitely get rid of that. And I did, I believe, in the final image that I took through in Photoshop. I find it much easier to remove those in Photoshop with the spot healing brush than to do that in Lightroom.
Right. But you actually carry a little brush and you physically remove them from the flower before you take the picture, if you can?
Absolutely.
Oh,
If it's
okay.
dirty like that, yes.
That's a nice technique.
You can use anything that's soft, a little pastry brush. even a little makeup brush.
How about a leaf blower?
Yeah, I don't think I'd try that. Bear with me a minute, just trying to get back to my library.
Yeah, I was joking about the leaf blower, but do you think one of those little rocket blowers would work like you use to blow dirt off your lens?
Sure.
Okay.
If
Yeah, I've
it's
never-
light
I-
enough.
Yeah, I've never tried that.
I have a little battery operated computer vacuum cleaner, very, very tiny. And you use that to clean out dust around components. And it's battery operated. So that could work on this. I'll have to try that at Ashcombs one of these days.
Oh.
Okay, this is the last one I'm going to show you as to how I applied the black background. Because this one I could not do in Photoshop simply because of the shape of the flower. Works well in Lightroom if it's a fairly round flower, so you don't have to do a lot of manual adjustments going in between where these crevices become kind of deep. And this one is fairly easy to do in Photoshop because the edges are smooth and simple. Now, if you have a flower that has a lot of complexity to the petals and a lot of jagged edges, Photoshop will have a hard time actually selecting that and identifying where the edges are. So Photoshop's not ideal for every type either, and it is much more difficult to do in Lightroom. But this one was particularly easy. And I'm going to again take you to the raw file. Okay, now this is another very tiny flower. It's called the Star of Bethlehem, and I think you can probably see why. Most people, excuse me, do not even see that because it is such a tiny flower. And again, because it was so tiny, I had to get very close to it. This was used with a macro lens. And I had to tighten up that aperture to make sure that I got all of the detail sharp across all of the petals and especially across the center. But because this flower was so close to the background and I was shooting down, I end up with this very messy, distracting background. And it was fairly dark as well. I can see that I had to bump my ISO up quite a bit, which I don't typically like to do. So I knew that I had to have a black background on this one as well. So I'm going to take this one into Photoshop. And I think I have to change my screen sharing again.
Yes, you need to go to Photoshop.
Joe, since we made that change in the settings, could she also just go to desktop?
Yeah, you can go to desktop and click it there. Mhm.
And if you can share your desktop, then any change you make, like from Lightroom to Photoshop, we would automatically see it. But we just made that change. We haven't done that with any presenters yet, but it should work.
Okay.
Yeah, we see Photoshop now.
All right. Now this thing's in my way up here. Okay, I'm going to automatically create a duplicate layer, which I do routinely, just preserve the original background file on here. The first thing I'm going to do, because I do see this very distracting piece of pollen, even though it's natural, it's not in the right spot and it does distract me. And this is where I would use the spot healing brush, very easy to do. Now, the next part of the process is a matter of selecting the flower. Quick selection tool. Get out of the way. And select subject. Now, Photoshop is going to look for the subject and it's going to create these marching ants lines. Can you all see those?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Now, whatever I do to this image at this point will affect the flower and not the background. So then I need to select, inverse, and it's going to create the marching ants around the whole image, which means what it has selected now is not the flower, but everything between the edges and the flower. And I create an adjustment mask. Sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. Closure. Messed up here, folks.
Happens to me all the time.
Okay. Now that did a pretty good job of outlining this flower. To me, it still looks a little bit unnatural, even though the edges are smooth and clearly defined. I would like to see a little more natural roundness to that so it doesn't look like it's cut and pasted on. And I'm going to do that actually I'm going to bring it back into Lightroom and do it there and shadow it almost like I did with the other flower that I showed you. But another way that you can do this is to create a mask and just take your brush and add a little bit of blur to the edges. It's a very manual process, but you actually just paint very lightly some blur to make that look a little bit less cut out. Now, while I'm in Photoshop, there's a couple of things that I prefer to do in here rather than Lightroom. I just think that they're more effective. And I'm not really very happy with the shadows and the highlights in this. I think it looks a little bit flat. And in Photoshop, there is an adjustment feature called shadows and highlights, which gives you a little more control than Lightroom in adjusting your shadows and highlights, and that you can control the tone that you are adjusting as well as the radius. I do not need to bring down the shadows. The highlights, I wanted to bring those down a little bit. So you can adjust the amount that you want to decrease it by, as well as the tone. Radius generally gives you a little more clarity when you move that over to the right a little bit.
Elaine, can you explain what the tone did on those adjustments?
Well, the tone, so instead of reducing the whole range of highlights, it would reduce only the range, the highest ones, according to what you set it at. So the lower it is on that scale, it's only going to reduce the highlights at that highest range. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay.
So if you move it all the way over to the right, it's going to adjust the whole range of highlights. And I only wanted to reduce that highest range in order to leave me a little bit more shadowing in there. It gives you a little bit more contrast that way. Now, because I know I'm not going to go back in and do anything with these layers, I am going to flatten the layers into one, which makes for a much smaller file, saving back into Lightroom. Sorry. Then go into File, Save. And now it's going to bring it back into Lightroom with those edits made. I'm going to have to change my screen sharing again. Oops, I'm right back where I was. Okay, now this is where I would go back in and attempt to create another vignette that will hopefully soften some of those edges. Or you can use your brush tool and just brush again around the edges and darken them up a little bit. Okay. So to me, that looks a little more natural than the cut and paste look.
Yep. Elaine, a question came in when you were working there. When you're using the flash to light your flower, how do you keep the flash light source hitting the background and brightening up the background?
It's not a problem when I'm using a diffuser on it and setting it at very low power. I don't, and it's one of the reasons though that I use a very matte finish on the black background, because it just, it will pick up sheen if it, or the highlights, if there's any kind of a sheen on that material, the flash will affect that and it will make it almost look gray as opposed to black. But as low as I set it on a matte finish, it doesn't seem to have an impact on it. In fact, it seems to sometimes make it even blacker just because it's exposing for a pretty short period of time.
Okay. Just so you're aware of the time, it's 7:40 right now.
Oh. Okay, so how much time do I have?
Well, we want to get Patti in there too, so I just wanted to let you know.
Okay. Yeah, a little glitch here. Sorry. Okay, so I have time just to go through probably a couple of more images just to talk about my vision and how I expose them. This is a particularly vibrant tulip. It caught my eye when the sun was beginning to set and it was shining through these leaves that were somewhat transparent. And that was what I was trying to capture. The background, again, was pretty messy. It was on a potting bench, actually, that was surrounded by some pretty dark foliage and it was very close in. So what I was trying to capture was not only the light, but also the soft edges of the tulips. So I shot that just tight enough so that I had sharpness all the way through here, but not necessarily there. Wasn't particularly challenging. I just had to brighten up some of the highlights in here. I might, if I were to take this further, blacken that out. I'm not sure. I don't find it particularly distracting. It was basically the color and the light in this image that caught my attention. This is actually the same flower. The day after that, it rained. And when it rained, for some reason, these petals tend to curl up, which I found very interesting. But I'm also always very interested in water droplets. I'm intrigued by them. So this one I shot with a macro lens, tighten that up to 6.3 again to make sure that all of the water drops were sharp. I know that when you try to photograph water drops with a shallow depth of field, what you often end up with is just big white flat blobs in your image, especially if you're overexposing it. So I had to intentionally, again, underexpose this a bit to make sure that the highlights and the drops weren't blown out. 6.3 was adequate for capturing the focus on most of them, especially these down under this particular petal.
Elaine, on that flower, the yellow that I'm seeing, were you able to see that when you were looking at the flower, or did you have to goose that up in Lightroom or Photoshop to get that yellow to come out?
I did brighten it up a little bit in Lightroom, but that was actually part of the glow caused by the light.
Okay.
The light was coming from above and behind it, so that it was actually glowing through this section here.
Okay. Will you ever take a handheld like LED light and hold it up there and create that glow coming down artificially?
I do that occasionally. I'll use just a little tiny flashlight, LED flashlight.
Okay.
This one really caught my attention because it was taken at dusk, kind of in the blue light. And I've always had a fascination with white and very pale pink flowers at dusk because they take on a glow that is almost like a night light. And I wanted the background to be very, very blurry, but not black. I wanted to reflect the colors that I saw at the time, which was kind of a dark green. I set this to a very shallow depth of field because I really didn't want the whole thing to be clear. I like the fact that the focus was kind of fading out in the background. I did want to see some detail in the surface of these petals, and I wanted to see the detail on this leaf, which was reflecting some beautiful light. I shot this actually at 150 millimeters, so it was from a distance. So naturally, the background was quite out of focus, even if I hadn't opened it up at 3.2. Made for a beautiful, beautiful background. This is another shot that I took at Ashkun's, and I wanted to get that gardenscape look. And these flowers weren't actually in a garden. They were in a kind of a dark shed in front of Ashkun's. I don't know if all of you have been there, but there's an area that has kind of a lathe house that provides some shade for some potted plants. And these were all in pots and kind of crowded together. So it's partly why it was dark, but I kind of liked that look. The color was stunning. I wanted to focus on one single flower and just have the rest of them kind of blur out in the background. So for that reason, I used a very shallow depth of field and had to shoot it fairly quick because there was some pretty bright light shining on this flower right here. Because I shot it quickly, that helped to darken the background a little bit more. Okay, I think I've probably used my time. So unless there's any other questions, I'll turn it over to Patti.
Patti, well, Elaine's getting your images up onto the screen. Can you tell us a little bit about you?
Certainly. My name is Patti Volpe. I live just a little bit south of Scranton currently. However, I used to live down in the Middletown area. And that's when I lived down there that I joined the West Shore Photography Club. I was in it for several years while I lived down there. And so when I moved back to this region, which is where I'm originally from, I lost contact with the club. But when COVID came, I had the opportunity to rejoin the club remotely. So I'm thrilled to be back in the club. I have a background in art, and I like to, in my photography of florals, I like to apply some painterly effects and some special effects to some of my images, making them a little bit, maybe just different, little painterly, like my background.
Thank you.
So I'll talk a little bit about my vision in photography. Elaine and I both have, we have differences and similarities in what we do, but we're different. We're different artists. Everybody is a unique artist behind the lens of a camera. So we use all the same equipment. We use cameras, we use processing programs, and we reuse the printing process in the creation of our art. Elaine and I both shoot with crop sensor cameras, mine being a Sony. However, many of my images may also be captured with my iPad or my phone, my iPhone, or whatever phone that might be around. How Elaine and I are very much alike is how we see flowers. When we look at a flower, we look at all the individual characteristics of that flower that draws us to that flower, the petal shape. Sometimes it's the amazing leaves and it's not even the petals of the flower, the color of the flower, the relationship of the flowers to the stem, or the relationship of the multiple stems to the plant as a whole. So in my first image, Elaine, could you flip?
I am trying. There you go.
There we go. What drew me to take this picture? What is it that I saw? So I was making an arrangement of flowers on my kitchen table for a friend, and I noticed that there was a fantastic reflection on the glass of my tabletop in my kitchen. The light was perfectly reflecting the lines of the vase and the soft colors. And the light quality at that moment had totally obliterated the spatial relationship of the tabletop to the back wall. All of it had blended into one single plane. So this bouquet had a second job that day. It wasn't just to cheer up a friend, but it was to be a model for a photo shoot for me. So in my mind, when I processed this image, I needed to echo what I saw in that moment, the moment that told me to go get my camera and record this. So the second image here is a Calla Lily. And this Calla Lily was growing behind my neighbor's garage. It was lost deeply within the undergrowth of her garden. I'm a frequent visitor to all the neighborhood gardens, and I might even be considered a peeping Tom. So on this day, my eye was not on this plant at all. I didn't even know it existed. There was a row of perennials that bordered a stone patio that I was headed after. However, as I passed by the garage, I saw this flash of color. I bent down and I separated the surrounding plants, and I revealed this beautiful plant, this beautiful Calla Lily. I knew at that moment, before I even took the portrait, what my processing was going to look like. I needed to process this image just as I saw it, just as how I revealed a glowing bud emerging from a hidden world. And that's how it needed to get. So ultimately, this is how I ended up with this processing. So the next image, this is a Dahlia in Mana. Dahlias are one of my favorite flowers to capture. The tightly repeated shapes of their curled petals I find extremely interesting. I'm most certain that I was deep in my sister's garden, likely on a run to her farm for fresh eggs, armed only with my cell phone when I captured this image. I love these petals so much, and I could edit their portraits 1,000 different ways. They are just such a cool flower. So a little bit earlier, I spoke about how Elaine and I are similar. Now I'll talk about how we differ. One of the differences in the programs that we process our images. Elaine's main programs are Photoshop and Lightroom, whereas my processing is all done on my iPad using built-in features and downloaded apps. She processes many dark, low-key, realistic images, as do I. A dark background truly reveals all the wonderful characteristics of a flower with little or no distractions. But with that said, I also love high-key images and processing with an artistic flair. Some people may say that some of my images lean more towards digital art. Whatever you want to call it, it's mine. So here's some of the apps that I use for processing. I'll be concentrating on just 2 of those apps in what I have to say today, this discussion about the addition of artistic filters. The 2 apps that I'm going to discuss are the top 2 on the left, both Snapseed and Brushstroke. As you can see here, Elaine and I can achieve similar results by utilizing the programs that we're each familiar with. The flower seen here is a seashell cosmos, beloved for its very interesting petal shapes and textures. The choice to darken the background lends well to highlight its petals and intricate features while removing all of the background distractions. This is a vase of peonies. This vase was from my garden and it's lovely on its own right, but my vision was to add a slight painterly effect. My goal was to use the filter to enhance the multitude of curls and twists of the peony's petals, which contrast nicely against the smooth, shiny white vase and the simple background, making a pleasing final image. In addition, the filter further enhances the image by adding a touch of texture to an otherwise flat, gray background. This is a dahlia in the rain. I'm going to show you a series of edits of this one single flower. In this case, a dahlia from my sister's garden. First, we see the original color image and what drew me to take the shot, the amazing petals. The fact that each petal has a darker background, a border outlining its shape, kind of like a woman's eyeliner. The stack upon stack of petals and the amazing water droplets. It's not a very pleasing image prior to processing. However, when I took the image, the characteristics of the flower are preserved. That was my goal. I have no concerns about the busy background, only that I'm capturing the detail of those petals as I saw them. So here I begin to edit, cropping, lightening, softening, applying a filter to the image. I draw out the lines on the petal's edges, making each petal as important as the whole, as if it's carefully rendered by an artist's watercolor brush. In the next edit, I simply flipped the original image to black and white. I increased the contrast and the clarity. And finally, I reduced the exposure of the background to obliterate any distractions. So this processing choice certainly highlights the wonderful qualities of the dahlia. And lastly, I converted this image to a high-key black and white image with a painterly effect, with close-up cropping. And I love the soft look. It's almost got a floaty feeling to it. So I ended up with 3 extremely different edits of the same flower, each having its own merits. So part of my goal here tonight is to show you a few original and edited images side by side, highlighting my application of artistic filters. First one is a yellow rose. The original image is in the upper left-hand corner. The flower wasn't in the best of condition. Several of its petals were showing its age. However, with a little bit of cropping and some healing, those blemishes were no longer evident, and the beautiful curves that take center stage, exactly what drew me to the flower in the first place, along with the little peak in the center, like a shy child or a blushing bride. Next image is a pink peony. Not much compares to the delicate petals of a peony. They're paper thin, fluted edges, layer upon layer of petals. The large petal size and their smooth surface are the perfect backdrop for water droplets. The droplets dance on their smooth surfaces. On capturing this image, my thoughts went immediately to a black and white to remove the color distraction and let the petal surfaces have their say. I then decided I'd like to see just a touch of a filter, just to soften the image a little bit. So the bottom right one includes that filter. These are cherry blossoms. It was a beautiful spring day, crystal blue sky, when I captured this image of my neighbor's cherry tree blossoms. Their layers of frilly petals are delightful. They're so delicate. They were just screaming the freshness of springtime. By adding this artistic filter, my goal was to magnify the light springtime feeling, softening the scene to the mood I felt when I captured it. This next series here was a self-challenge. I had captured some images of botanical prints from an old book at an auction house, and I've always been enthralled with artists' renderings of botanicals. I challenged myself to shoot and edit a rose image to make it appear as the old botanical print from the book appeared. So I began by watercoloring a background and got to work clipping a rose in my yard. The process required quite extensive edits to achieve the desired results. I've since produced a couple of these images and will likely over time add to this collection utilizing different flowers. So this finishes my before and after section, and I'd like to take you through 2 images that I edited for this presentation. I'll speak a little bit about the programs I utilize along the way. So I perform basic edits in the programs native to my iPad and phone, as well as the apps of Snapseed and filters I apply in brushstroke. There are many artistic filters in Snapseed also, however, many of those I feel give poor results to floral images. So I found that the filters in brushstroke just seem to blend better with florals. So here's the first image that I'll talk about. This is a dahlia again and bud. I love pink and green, lime green together. It's a wonderful contrast in a floral image. So it's my intent to process this image for it to become a little bit more of a high key image with a painterly effect. Dahlias have those wonderful shapes and I want to accentuate those. So to achieve this goal in Snapseed, I need to increase the exposure in the background by the use of a brush tool. When using Snapseed, the brush is your fingertip. So here I've brushed the larger areas of the background, but have not gotten near the petal edges. My fingertip is too broad to delve into the petal crevices. So I'll need to enlarge the image to carefully edit those crevices. The enlargement's done just as you would on your phone touch screen. You're just going to pinch that screen and expand your fingers. This allows access to the delicate petal edges. So if there's bleed over, it's no problem. You're just going to change that percentage down to 0 and brush it away. Here I made a couple of intentional marks on the pink to show you on there how, and you would just, before you accept it, you just take care of them. So after completing the exposure adjustments, there are black spots that are quite distracting. And I use the healing tool to remove them, trial and error to get something acceptable. After making a slight additional adjustment to sharpening, I'll then crop out the leaf on the bottom right. So at this point, I'm fairly happy with the image and I'll save the image and move over to the brushstroke program. In brushstroke, I applied my favorite filter, which is simple. You can see that they're on the bottom slider, that the simple one of them is circled in pink here. And I adjusted that filter to 66%, which is up on the top. The filter is simply applied by touching your choice. Adjustments are made by sliding your finger right or left across the image. So in the next image, I then am going to move to adjusting tools. And here I'm going to deal with the density of that filter just a little bit more, adjusting it from 66 to 32. And again, this is only an adjustment via the pleasure of my eye. Please note that on this tool menu, there's lots of adjustments, just like you would make local adjustments: brightness, contrast, saturation, density, vibrance, exposure, shadows, highlights. All of those things can be adjusted in this program. However, I usually make those adjustments prior to coming in here. So I don't usually use these adjustments too much in this program. So on the next screen, I'm going to adjust here the thickness of the texture, and that's a little paintbrush over here on the right side of the adjustment bar. So by sliding your finger again across that, I find that a lot of the textures that they apply a lot of squiggly lines to the surface. I don't really like all that squiggle. It's fine if you've got a little tiny picture, but when you start making your picture up to a normal size, all you see is squiggle. So here is where you adjust the amount of that squiggle. I also don't, as I'm looking at this now, I don't like that green spot over by the right border, but I'm going to deal with that when I go back and apply a frame to this image. So at this point, I think I'm okay with where I'm at, and I've saved the image. I move it back to Snapseed to apply framing and text. I always add my framing first. This makes the positioning of the text within the framed image easier. I had to crop just a tiny bit off that right side of the image to clear the dark green distraction, but only a smidge, as the remainder was hidden under the framing. I could have applied a wider frame to cover the green without cropping, but that affected the image overall in an unpleasant way. The increased framing changed the relationship of the flower to the border. So here you see the two images, what I started with and what I finished side by side, framed and with text. For the second image, I'm gonna do a double exposure that's applied in processing versus being shot. So this first image, I shot an out of focus black-eyed Susan with the intent of using it as a filter. It'll be my background choice. And the second image is a white seashell cosmos, which will be added over the backdrop. I love these petals, the flower petals and their tendril leaves. I often cut their stems and leaves to add to greenery and bouquets because they have such a little feathery look to them. So I brought both images into Snapseed, layering them into a double exposure, and I could immediately see that I need to do work on that brown-eyed Susan image. So I backed up to just that image. And the work that I applied first, I brightened the image globally. Then I used a healing tool and removed most of the dark flower centers. Third, I applied a lens blur to soften the shapes. However, when I applied that, it darkened the outer edges. So lastly, I added a touch of a white vignette to compensate for the darkened edges. So here's the two relayered in comparison from where we started on the background to where we ended after the edits. So I'm accepting where we're at. I saved the image as I'm pleased with the improvements. And now I'm going to move back to brushstroke to apply a filter. So when opening the app, the program paints the image with the first filter available on the slider bar. You have to scroll through the filters on the slider bar located at the bottom of the screen to find a pleasing effect. Once the filter is chosen, I adjust the density a bit and move to the final adjustment panel. Here I'm going to again adjust the thickness of the actual texture to smooth it out to a more pleasing finish. I then experimented with the addition of a few papers or surface textures like canvas and stone. However, I came back to this edit being my favorite choice. So being confident at this point, I saved the image to move back to Snapseed to apply framing and text. And here's the final image of the frame double exposure. So that concludes my presentation, other than an image that I did specifically for this. During Elaine's presentation last week, I commented about using a watercolored background for some images. So I'm going to present one here, just post-processing. I first chose a color palette and I washed some watercolor onto a very wet piece of watercolor paper. I allowed it to dry a little bit, and then I added paint splatter blown about with my hair dryer, and this will be used as a backdrop. Clip some flowers from my garden really close behind them with no stems, and staying within the same color palette, I arranged them on the backdrop and started shooting. After choosing my image, edits and filters were applied, and here's my final image. So typically, I prefer a light hand in applying edits. However, this image, I love this heavy edit on it. And sometimes our visions take a left turn, and that's okay. So I have one last floral image from this watercolor series that I'll show you. And in this one, there was no artistic filters in the process. Rather, I like the relationship of the watercolored background to the rutabaga, just as it was. So thanks for listening on how I create my vision. And thanks, Elaine, for asking me to join you in presenting our visions of floral photography.
Patti, that was fantastic. Thank you. I think
Thanks, Joe.
learned so much from there, how you stepping us through the process and how you saw it. That was really, really, really good. Thank you.
presentations were brilliant.
Yeah. Any questions for Patti or Elaine?
I have a question for Patti.
Yep.
I'm Terry. Do
Hi.
you shoot most of yours from a tripod or are they handheld?
Handheld.
Handheld.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? Elaine, you started this whole thing with your original class, and then we all went on our field trip. And then we got to see how you actually process some of your images tonight. And then you roped Patti into coming into the session tonight to share her visions, which were both really exciting. We really, really appreciate it. I think, can we unmute everybody, Dennis?
No, they have to do that themselves.
Okay, if you could unmute yourself, we would appreciate that. And would like to give a big round of applause. Yay.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great. So now we're going to be back onto Facebook in a couple of days and posting more things with Snapseed maybe this time too.
Very good. Thanks, ladies. Quite a passion for flowers. You look at flowers in a way that I don't have that capability or talent. But maybe I'll try a little harder from now on and look at them more carefully. I really appreciate your artistic vision. So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Okay.
Anything
So
else, Joe?
Nope, I think that's it. Next Monday night is dealing with ISO.
Okay, very good.
See you next
Thanks,
week.
Elaine. Thanks, Patti.
you.
Thanks, everyone, for attending tonight. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.